I just want to let you know that I think in the beginning for us in working in HIV and AIDS, some people in the room, if you've been around as long as I have, some of you might recognize that when the government of Canada started to fund HIV and AIDS research, it actually was housed at a program called National Health Research Development Program, NHRDP. It was not well situated. They had no idea what they were doing, but they had money for HIV research. So in the very beginning, I was engaged in research. Just a little bit about myself. I grew up in Dryden, Ontario, or near Dryden, Ontario, and that's where I went to high school. And then I went to Confederation College and got an accounting diploma, and I thought that was my golden road to Toronto and a better life. When I got here, my first job that I applied for, there were 80 people applying for the same job. I was not to become an accountant. So what happened was that I ended up engaging, as most Aboriginal people, when they came to the city of Toronto, to the Aboriginal community. And I got very involved in the beginning and went to the Friendship Center when it was on Beverly Street. And that was my sort of first introduction to the Aboriginal community in Toronto. So, and that's in the late 70s. So when the government created the HIV research field, they then moved it over to Health Canada. That was not much better. So they had to figure out how they were going to distribute the funds that the government had set aside for HIV research. And we advocated in the early days that we needed very specific research projects that dealt with the Aboriginal community. I was doing some work here in Toronto, but my journey took me to British Columbia, and I was asked to go there to help prepare and write the Aboriginal strategy for HIV and AIDS in British Columbia. And during that process, when they announced that there was funding available for Aboriginal communities to do HIV research, there was $500,000 available to communities across Canada. And at that time, there were about 10 Aboriginal organizations doing HIV/AIDS work. And as I was thinking of what kind of research project I wanted to do in BC, it was very innovative, I guess, at that time, was around doing a mapping project, a GIS mapping project of where were the services available in British Columbia. And as I wrote the proposal, I was thinking of my colleagues who are doing this kind of work in other places of Canada. And I thought, 500,000 divided by 10, I'll apply for 50,000. I didn't have time to check in with my other colleagues. I got funded, and the rest of my colleagues didn't put in for a research project. Had I known that, I would have went for 500,000, and that sort of started my work in doing research. And over the years, I've actually self-taught myself to the point today where I have a common CV, so the researchers in the room will know what a common CV is. And even after today, I have some people that help me to fill in my common CV. They'll say to me, I did see you speak in Toronto on October 29th between 1 and 2 p.m. We're going to put that in your common CV. So I have people that actually help me to keep on top of all of the research projects that I'm doing. And one of them this morning you saw was the tobacco reduction strategy. So I'm fortunate to partner up with some of the other agencies here in Toronto, for example, St. Michael's Hospital and Dr. Janet Smiley, who did a health research project around racism of Aboriginal people in the city of Toronto. And from there, we now are conducting another research project called Our Health Counts. There are 70,000 Aboriginal people in the city of Toronto, and we're trying to reach 1,800 of them. So they're using the seed process of recruiting participants, and we're struggling with that. So we've got up to about 600, and we're looking for more people to join us in the research project. But of course, of who I am and what community I represent, the Two-Spirit community, when I'm involved in research, I always make sure that our community voices are heard. So as we do the demographics for the studies, I make sure that under sex and sexual orientation, that the Two-Spirit community can see themselves and do a tick box to make sure that they're included. So that's one of the reasons of my involvement in doing research. I've been fortunate enough to also partner up with Dr. Janice Ristock from University of Manitoba, and we did a migration and mobility study of the impacts of Two-Spirit people when they move to an urban center. But unfortunately, those two studies were done in Winnipeg and Vancouver. But if you can imagine, you think that the experiences of people when they migrate to move to an urban center, that they would be the same. It wasn't, to my amazement. I'm going to out somebody in here. Dr. Anita Benoit, if you can stand up. She is at Women's College Hospital, and she's after me all the time to join her research projects. And the latest one that she's gotten me involved in, which I'm very, very interested in, is that we're going to be looking at an Aboriginal women and HIV and AIDS stress study. And to me, the way that it's going to unfold is very interesting because I've never been part of it, and I hope I'm saying this right, Anita, by saying that we want to have a large number of Aboriginal women and actually take swabs of their saliva to test the stress level at various points. I've never done that before. I'm looking forward. I will learn as I go through the process. But I can stand here all day and just share with you my experience and journey along that road of the importance of doing research by us and for us. Because if you realize in Canada, and I always say to some of our communities that it always had been the parachute piece of where people came into our communities, did the research, published it in academic journals, and never returned it back to our communities. So we were at a disadvantage of finding out what happened during that study. But now we're able to, and today is another example of knowledge transfer and exchange. When I go out to speak to our communities, I always say out our acronyms. There's a number of us in the room. If I said KTE and all these other short forms, in a lot of our communities, people wouldn't understand that. A number of years ago, I was with Renee Mashing, and she's with the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, and she happened to be here in Toronto, and they invited me out to dinner. And I had no idea that I was being set up for yet another research project. And this time it was with Dr. David Brennan from the University of Toronto. And when we first sat down, we had great ideas of doing research. And basically Dr. Brennan, all he wanted to do was to have the opportunity to work with our community, the Two-Spirit community. And I had no idea what the research project would sort of unfold, but after we got together and had, several meetings with community members and organizations, we realized what we needed to research was the longevity of people who are living in our community with HIV and AIDS. And what I was noticing that we have community members who have lived for 25 to 30 years with HIV and have done it very successfully, right? And what I wanted to do was to find out why that was possible in our community. when you often go into a presentation, you'll see in Dr. Evans's presentation this morning, the mortality rate of Aboriginal people who are living with HIV and AIDS, and how we always have said that, you know, in the Aboriginal community, when people are living with HIV, they are sooner to die than other people. But in my community, what I wanted to research was come at it at a positive side. Of these guys who were living with HIV and AIDS for 10 years or more, what were their experiences? And one of the things that I learned in doing research was that when you do research, you have one question. And as my colleague here, who is standing closely by, ready to go on it any second, because he's extremely been very, very helpful for us in this community. And I don't know what I'll say it now. Anyways, George, who was part of the research team, we were in a meeting, and if you can imagine us as Aboriginal people trying to convey our worldview to non-Aboriginal people is sometimes very, very difficult, very challenging. And all of a sudden, George pipes up and says, "I get it." And we looked at him and we said, "Who are you? Can you give us a little bit of background of who you are and where you come from?" And George is from the Roma people and is a young gay man. And I always said to him, when you go to present, always bring that fact out, because you're presenting Indigenous research back to our communities. And the moment that you say that in our communities, people will relate to that, right? So it's important to always identify who you are and how you present that information back to our communities. I'm losing steam here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do it in two parts. George is going to do the first part of the presentation, and then I'm going to get up and do the second part. So George, I've handed over to you.
So as Art said, my name is Georgie Offski. I actually started off, thank you. I started off as part of this research project as a research assistant with Professor David Brennan, who's at the Factor and Mentosh Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto. He couldn't be here today, and he sends his regrets. And it was kind of serendipitous, my falling into this research project, and it's been an amazing journey, and it's been an absolute honor and pleasure to be able to work with Two-Spirit Aboriginal community and Aboriginal people living with HIV/AIDS in such a capacity. As Art outed me, I am a mixed-race Indigenous gay man. I am Roma. For those of you who doesn't know what that means, I am a gypsy. So hide the silverware. And so I kind of, coming from a mixed household of having a Roma father and a white mother, that understanding, navigating that in between, and understanding how to translate and negotiate what can be a very tense, anxiety-inducing process and place to be in has kind of been a norm of my life. So I just need, so the SHAWLS project is the Two-Spirit HIV/AIDS Wellness and Longevity Study. We, before I get into the actual study, our research team was made up of mixed Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal investigators and community representatives. We had people from the Ontario Aboriginal HIV/AIDS strategy. We had folks from the Nine Circles Community Health Clinic, the Toronto Aboriginal Care Team, the Union of Ontario Indians HIV/AIDS program, and the Two-Spirit people of the First Nations. We were funded by a Catalyst grant from CIHR, all that good stuff. So the study came about as a result of the statistics are, I'm sure you've seen them. If not this morning, you've seen them from probably before. HIV disproportionately affects the Aboriginal community in Canada. 70% of all Aboriginal people living with HIV have an AIDS diagnosis. And as a result of issues of access and engagement with care, Aboriginal people living with HIV face later diagnoses, slower uptake of medications and treatments, higher morbidity and higher mortality rates. So this information, these statistics, everyone is familiar with, and we know them very well. However, they represent a partial description. They represent a description that oftentimes in research and in healthcare is used to paternalize Aboriginal people living with HIV/AIDS, to create systems of care that undermine, Aboriginal people's self-determination, undermine Aboriginal people's strength, resilience, and well-being. And so we took the two SHAWLS study as a way of understanding how we can, how we can study Two-Spirit, Aboriginal gay men's resilience, as well as how we can, one, from a methodological perspective, but two, how we can change the discourse and how we can begin to change the discourse. So the goals of our study were to better understand the factors, skills, resources, knowledge, and practices that contribute to Two-Spirit men's health and well-being living long-term with HIV. So in this case, long-term being more than 10 years. So there were a couple of different parts of this study. So methodologically, we used decolonizing and indigenous methodologies. Recruitment was we were assisted in recruitment through the Ontario Aboriginal HIV/AIDS strategy and the Two-Spirits. And so there were, in essence, I call them three, but there were two parts. We did a lit review, a scoping review of the literature to see what material was out there, what already has been written about, and what we found was that there's a whole lot of nothing. We looked through over 16,000 articles, of which 3 actually looked, or not even looked at, touched upon Two-Spirit Aboriginal men's resiliency living long-term with HIV/AIDS. So, from 16,000 to 3 paints a picture of how the literature understands this topic. The second part were focus groups that we envisioned as sharing circles. And Art, I'm just totally taking this from Art every time he presents, but in the Aboriginal community, a sharing circle and a talking circle are two very different things. A talking circle is something much more intimate, something that happens between you and the creator. But a sharing circle is something where, sorry, I'll slow down. A sharing circle is something where, we took a medicine wheel that we created for this study, we put it on the floor, everyone sat around it, and we asked one question, right? We asked, what's allowing you to live well long-term with HIV? And that was it. There was no interview, there were no talking points, we just asked one question and allowed, within that space, the conversation to happen naturally, and it happened beautifully. The analysis, we used the participatory symbol-based inquiry model. So, for many of you who are not familiar, what that means is that we grounded our analysis in the medicine wheel. We used the medicine wheel, we mapped quotes that we pulled from the transcripts. We used the medicine wheel to ground our analysis, to ground how we understood the stories of our participants. And the medicine wheel was an integral aspect to every facet of this study, including the analysis. When, picture a bunch of people in a small room with the walls covered in printed out transcripts, highlighting and writing numbers and then mapping it onto a big medicine wheel in the center of the room. So it was not your traditional Western SPSS-based study. So we had Two-Spirit men living with HIV for more than 10 years. We had 12 First Nations men, 2 Métis. We didn't have, unfortunately, any men from the Inuit community. The average age was 46 years old. And from our analysis, we found the 7 truths paths. We're still struggling with the name a little bit, but the 7 paths of resiliency for Two-Spirit men. And Art will go through them in much more detail, so I won't focus a lot on them now. But I will also talk about, and we'll show you in after Art goes through the 7 paths of resilience. the third part of our study, which I think is probably the most groundbreaking, is that we wanted to find a way to represent our data in a way that was accessible, that was indigenous in of itself, and was in essence decolonizing, because it countered the old, like, here's a report, read it, here you go, this is what we found. So after Art presents, or while I will actually go through, I think we'll have enough time to go through the visualization. It's an online tool that represents our findings. So I won't go into detail now, but...
Okay. This is interesting, the way that we were able to connect up with a company in Ottawa called Earthfloor. And you'll see the graphics here. So to us, as Aboriginal people, this would really resonate with our communities. So near Peterborough, Ontario, the Anishinaabe people use pictographs in some of the rocks, and maybe some of you have visited that site. So what we wanted to do was use that visualization in presenting this information back to our communities, right? And so, as George explained, right, so this one is worldview and what we believe in. But what I want to do is before you go there, George, I just want to sort of illustrate that this represents a person, another one there, and another one here. What we wanted to make sure is that we had animal figures in here too. And you'll see these dots and things like that coming out. Those are sort of representing of the world, the sky, the universe as we go through it. So the world view was interesting because it's how we view the world, right? So you may be familiar with the medicine wheel: emotional, spiritual, physical, and mental, right? So for us, like, in all these years that I've been doing this work too, I often ask our non-Aboriginal people around their connection to spirituality. And a lot of times, especially in the gay men's community, I've never really gotten a really good answer from them about their connection to spirituality. But for us, spirituality is very important. It's a part of who we are. And I'll use an example. Last week I was at the Canadian AIDS Treatment Information Exchange Forum. And I was so wrapped up into the information that was being presented to me, it was overwhelming. And when I went home that evening, I dreamt that the Minister of Health was writing me a prescription. So I was like, oh my God, I'm even dreaming about it. But to Aboriginal people, when they say those kinds of things, like, so for example, somebody will say to me, I dreamt of my grandfather last night and he came to visit me. And this individual has been deceased for a number of years. So we believe very much in the spiritual world. And as Ed opened up this morning in a good way, he was actually calling in our ancestors to come and help us and guide us throughout the day of who we are, to be here with us today, to watch us, to observe us, to guide us in a good way. So as Aboriginal people, that's how we think. And sometimes when somebody comes up to you and says, I had this dream last night, you don't dismiss it. You actually listen to what they have to say, because sometimes it may be a very important message that some people are receiving. So I can just even go on for hours on this one, because, in our community, a lot of people have Aboriginal names. And the Aboriginal names sometimes come from within, that a person will have a dream about an animal, a bear or whatever. Then they will go see somebody in our community who is able to help them and guide them and actually give them their Aboriginal name. As a youngster, I have two sisters who are younger than me. And I remember when I was very, very young, probably about 5 years old, that I was awakened. They were born in August 1st and August 7th. And they received their names early in the morning. So if you get up in the morning in August, the sun comes up really early. So as a kid at 5 years old, I'm sitting there going like, my God, what's going on? You know, why do I have to get up so early? And I was told, you sit there and you observe and watch. And what we're doing is we're doing a ceremony to give your sisters their name, right? So I learned by that, right? And so in our world view, it's who we are and how we're made up. So when we look at somebody, we just don't look at the physical part or if somebody comes to us very upset and being very emotional. We don't look at that. We look at all of them. So even on my journey, when I became infected with HIV and diabetes at the same time, probably about 12 years ago, I ended up at St. Michael's Hospital. And I was in the palliative care unit. And you'll soon recognize that when you hear about Aboriginal people becoming infected with HIV, that they tend to be diagnosed at the later stages of HIV and AIDS, right? So of AIDS, in my case, my CD4 count upon admission was 60. And further, when I was in the hospital, my CD4 count went down to 30. So my community realized that I needed some help. So what they did is they brought in the two-spirit drum. They brought in blades of sweetgrass, the braided ones, and tobacco. And my sister, who was then still on this earth, in her life, she was always told, wherever you sleep, no matter where you sleep, at home, away on a vacation, wherever you are, you have to have an eagle feather on the wall above your head to protect you. When I got sick, my sister said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this eagle feather above your bed so that you'll get better. And so on my deathbed in the hospital, the nurses, the orderlies, the cleaning lady, the 11 doctors that helped me to recover, I had to explain to them, what are those items in that corner? And how do those items help me on my recovery back to good health? And 4 days later, I walked out of the hospital and on my road to recovery. And my getting on the antiretrovirals 12, 13 years ago was less than 1 month at that time, which for other people would have taken longer. So they realized that they needed to put me on the antiretrovirals. Just on that point alone, I am 100% compliant around taking my medications. And only once did I miss. And when you go traveling and you have to do HIV/AIDS work, I pack my medicine inside my suitcase. I was going to Cranbrook, British Columbia, and my suitcase went to Vancouver. So I was without my medication for 24 hours. And not knowing the medications and how they could react to me, I took all of them at the same time. And then I was like, whoa, I knew not to do that ever again. Anyways, those are some of my personal stories. And then so as we talk to the guys, the next truth or path towards resiliency was finding one's own strength. And George mentioned that in the sharing circles that the people, we placed 1,300 quotes inside the medicine wheel. And we'll show you later on what that looks like. 1,300 quotes is a lot. We had envisioned that this would be so futuristic that it would be in a sphere and that you would be able to grab a quote and place it there and it would be right in front of you. So that's what our goal was. We never got there. We have to use the current technology, so we're even ahead of ourselves. So recognizing one's true power, you can see here during the image that the guys sort of came to the point of recognizing their power, and in some of the communities, the bear is a very strong representation of of the true power, and the connecting to community for healing. So just read you a quote. It's like my whole life has been trying to learn how to love myself, and I'm there now. I finally figured out how to do it. It took other people to do it. It took me being real and vulnerable in front of other people. I was going to cry here just for to really emphasize the point, and seeing my reflection back at me and learning to trust. Yeah. You could tell that I've been speaking for a long time. I know how to add things in. So when we're walking on our path, as I've said throughout the day quite often, on our journey, right? And just another thing too, the way that I look at my journey here on Mother Earth is that even before I came here, I made the decision this is what I was going to do in my life. So coming from the spirit world, right, we come in through the eastern door. And as we live our life, we exit through the western door. So that's where I am right now, in that point of walking towards that western door and realizing that one day I will get there. And that's who we are as Aboriginal people, to know that that's part of our journey. And for others, you know, they realize what their journeys are. Minabamantawin means in Anishinaabe, in my language, means to live a good life. And again, you'll see through these graphics here that the individual, we use the winged ones in here, and then this is sweetgrass. Again, going back and making it relevant to present to our communities. So this quote, it doesn't matter if you're brand new or your diagnosis coming up to 30, that you've had this thing, that's a long, long time to live with it. When I was younger, I didn't know anything. I had to learn it. But what I've seen was more knowledge than ever I got from a book or going to a circle. At that time, there was no circle. We didn't have much of a voice as we do today as Aboriginal people. We've come a long way, and we're becoming stronger. That's the scary part. And I think that's what I'm feeling. It's that now, even though half of me is saying no, and you're not doing well at all, and you know you're not, I know I'm not, but when I have other side of myself where I say, you know what? From then until now, I think I'm stronger, and I think I have a little bit more knowledge of what's happening to me. So the realization of living with HIV and living in a good life. So just to sort of let you know that because of the health conditions that I have, I'm not able to participate in some of our cultural activities. For example, here in the city of Toronto, just down the street and across the park over here, is Anishinaabe Health. And Anishinaabe Health has sweats, and every third Monday of each month is a sweat for True Spirit people. And so, like, when I go, like, I can't go inside the sweat lodge, but what I can do is sit outside the sweat lodge and help prepare, you know, what is needed for the people that are inside the sweat lodge. So you probably didn't realize that just right down the street there's a sweat lodge. And if people know where Native Child and Family Services, which is on College and Yonge, there's actually a sweat lodge on the top of the building. You might not have known that. But for us as Aboriginal people, we know where to seek out some of these cultural activities. And at St. Clair and Yonge is Dotem, which is a place of where elders are available. So sometimes what we'll do for some of our community members is let them know that a particular elder is going to be at Dotem, and that it's a free event, much like today what we're experiencing here. And anyways, on that journey too is the self-care, sustaining, the journey and living the good life. I find that the best therapy for me is communing with nature. The birds will sing to me, and somebody will walk alongside, and the birds will stop. Then as soon as they get a certain distance away, they'll start again. It's like I sit there, and I find it so joyful because it's just like singing to me. It's great that way. Yeah, the struggles will always be there. It's about navigating a course through them as quickly as possible and taking the least amount of it that you can and trying to get off as quickly as possible, because anything that we hold on to that's negative or with darkness in it will only add to our misery, right? So letting go of certain things. And I just want to say in this part around the way that we view death, the way that I view death is like when I was young, before I even moved to the city of Toronto, I probably had known in my community probably about 200 people that had died, right? And from all kinds of things, from fires, from accidental deaths to car accidents to alcoholism to cirrhosis of the liver and many other things. But the way that I view it is it's not a time of sadness for me, because it's a time of reflection about that person that I encountered on that journey. And when I don't usually shed tears during that process, and what I do is I reflect on that person's life, right? Of course I'm going to miss him, but I'll give you an example. My brother passed away a number of years ago, and now being the oldest in my family, my responsibility was to be there. And so we went to a community hall, and I lost count how many nieces and nephews and relatives I have, and the young ones. So even in our community, when we have a ceremony like that, the young ones, they're kind of cute, we're teaching them, and you have to teach them along the way. So one of the things that we do in my nation is that we build a sacred fire outside the hall, we prepare a meal, and then we have one of two things that we can do. Everybody is given tobacco. And a little 5-year-old, one of my nephews, was given tobacco, and he was standing there and being really respectful of the ceremony, really paying attention and really learning. But then we were watching him, and he realized there was something in his pocket that he wanted, right? So we watched him, and he went like this, right? And when he did that, some of the tobacco fell down, right? And then he held it. He got this thing out of his pocket, put it in his shirt pocket, and then did this again. And he dropped some more, right? But we were like smiling at him because he was supposed to keep it in his left hand the whole time. So as we go outside, so we have the meal, right? And then you have a plate of food. And what we do is we say, this is the last time that I'm going to eat with you on Mother Earth. Until I see you again, this is the offering of food that I want you to take on your journey to the spirit world, right? But also, too, you don't have to necessarily put the food in the fire, but also what you can do is just use the tobacco and say something to send the spirit to the spirit world. And also at the same time, we're going back to some of our original ways of the way that we buried people. So, for example, my brother was wrapped in a Pendleton blanket and no coffin, right? So the way that they did it a long time ago is they put several logs this way, and it's only 4 feet down compared to other practices that go deeper. Then they placed cedar. Then they placed my brother's body, and then another row of logs, and then more cedar. So then everybody comes along and puts some earth on top of my brother. And then what I noticed was some of my nieces and nephews were not letting go. They couldn't move away. Because at that point, you've said your goodbyes, and now it's time to leave, right? So I had to sort of escort them out of the way and to be part of that ceremony. But the story, or why I mentioned that, is that in our communities, we teach, I said earlier that the naming ceremony, I was 5, I remember that, right? So all of these things that you grow up with, you bring with you to an urban center. And so when we started to experience a lot of deaths in our communities, there was a lot of discrimination or fear of even the bodies going back home to the communities. And we were here in Toronto, and we were like, these are our friends, and what do we do? You know, so we started to do our own ceremonies here, the Two Spirit people, and we called it a celebration of life. And because we were from Inuit country, we were from Mi'kmaq country, we were from Anishinaabe country, it was not unusual for somebody to say or sing a song from their nation, and everybody else would, you know, understand what that person was doing. But anyways, back to the seventh truth. Living our truth, accepting and learning to live with our whole selves. I needed to learn how to love myself, and I knew if I didn't learn how to love myself, that my dislike of myself would kill me. I started to learn how to love me, love my two-spiritedness, love my gayness. So this is what the guys are saying, that it was an opportunity for them for the first time to ever say that publicly, you know, or in a sharing circle or part of a research project, right? And that is so important. And that person today is probably feeling very, very good about themselves, about how they were able to contribute to this project.
I often quote Tony Nobis, who's the executive director of the Ontario Aboriginal HIV/AIDS strategy, and I quote him only because this is the first time I had heard this, and he's the person that I heard it from. But he said, you know, we don't need another report sitting on the shelves collecting dust. And this is not something that, you know, for Aboriginal people engaging with research, this is not the first time that, you know, people have said this, right? This is something that has been said for a very, very long time. And so here with the Two-SHAWLS study, we want to take the opportunity to listen and to actually find a way to enact this. And so we created this online tool as a way of presenting our findings, but as well as a way of engaging the Aboriginal community, of engaging community members who could use this as a source of inspiration, of reflection, of in whatever capacity, whatever way they need to. And so I'll take you step by step through it. And so we start with the description of the study itself, and then you move through each of the 7 truths. And for each of the 7 truths, we have an explanation of them that's grounded in the quotes of participants. So it's not, you know, and here you can find a much, you know, a longer, much more detailed presentation of their voices, of our participants' voices, and how we came to understand these 7 paths or truths. So each of the 7 truths or represent a collection of quotations that we mapped in the analysis process. And so to understand how we came to this truth, to this path, to being able to identify, to name it, we actually present a map of the quotes themselves. And so this is, in our analysis process, this is actually a snapshot of us mapping, and each of those dots represents a participant's quote, and it's mapped across the medicine wheel, across 4 quadrants and 7 rings. That if you, Art, do you want to talk about the quadrants and rings?
So in the middle is the individual or the self, right? So when they're talking about themselves, this is where we put their quotes. So if it had to do with mental, it would end up here, physical here, and emotional, and then spiritual. So as we go around the circle, then it goes to family, community, support, nation, world, and then the universe. And I just want to say at this point that for us, we use the term universe, but also the term universe would also mean the creator to us. So as people spoke and wrote down their quotes, it was our job to recognize that that individual may have been talking about their the spiritual piece, right? It's not the universe like traveling to Mars or beyond and into the future. So, as you can imagine, us putting all these quotes in this graph was very, very challenging. So, maybe move it to the next piece.
So
yeah, go ahead, George.
So normally on a bigger computer, it's much easier to, when it's not on a projector, it's easier to navigate. But you can scroll through each of the truths. And so you can then zoom in to a quadrant and ring. And actually, so for, so this is the, in the worldview truth, this is the emotional quadrant, and this is what people talked about when they talk about family and how that relates to both, this point on the medicine wheel, but always remembering that it's about the whole medicine wheel. It's not just understanding the specific quadrant without its connection to the entire medicine wheel. And so anyone can click on a quote and read what folks had to say about, how they use cultural assets and resources to inform the resilience in relation to family and to their emotional well-being. So a quote, one of my biggest supports in my family as well is my sister. I give thanks to her. She did our family history, and that's how we discovered that we have indigenous ethnicity in us, so that was great. It was fabulous, and I've been learning a lot about the culture. We've even done a book here. So all of these quotes represent factors, challenges, understandings, conceptualizations of resilience for our participants. And so these are, for me personally, these are a source of reflection, a source of inspiration.
Well, I think one of the things I've been doing a lot of research, and we actually first presented this in Sydney, Australia, to the International Indigenous group working on HIV and AIDS, right? the summit that we did. And George and I and David were presenting. And never before in my life had I ever experienced that an elder would get up and in the middle of a presentation and interrupt, right? And I was actually quite shocked. I thought, oh my God. And she was an Aboriginal elder from Australia. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? Have I offended the territory that have come to share our work? But what she said was, I'd like to stop you right there because, and we're like halfway through, I think. And she said, I'm really pleased to see the work that you guys are doing in Canada, but there was probably about 300 people at this conference, and she said, I want you to present this to everybody. Everybody needs to hear this, not just in the particular workshop that we were in. And that was the first time it ever happened to me in my life, and I was so pleased. And we actually had, I think, 15 minutes the next day. When you go to international conferences, you have like 10, 15 minutes, right? That was quite a shock. So we actually presented a couple of times. But also, I think, around doing research and getting this back out to our communities, what we presented here today around the resiliency that happens in our communities. Like I had seen it for a number of years, but you actually almost have to do a research project to unearth why did that happen? How did that happen that way? What were people actually thinking? And then I remember in some of the 1,300 quotes, that in the early days when we were on Carlton Street and we just had sort of started our work in this field, that people would actually come to our office and they would walk through the door. Walking through the door for some people living with HIV and AIDS is very, very extremely difficult. For the person to walk through that door and stand there and cry, we were all working and we all looked up at each other and we went, oh my God, what did we do? Did we offend them? Are they mad? Are they angry? Why? But the person was experiencing so much emotion around that they were living with HIV and AIDS that they were able to cross that door and stand there and start to address the issues of living with HIV and how this organization could support them along the way. And so we experienced a lot of that. I wish Karina was here today, because one of the stories that we just experienced recently was a Two-Spirit man was living in Florida, and he was making his way back to his traditional territory, which is near southwestern Ontario, by Chatham and Windsor area. And he made it as far as St. Michael's Hospital. And we've been around for 25 years, and here in the city of Toronto, a lot of the agencies know who we are and what we do. So the moment that that person was admitted to hospital, the hospital staff phoned up Karina. Karina went over and made the connection with him and actually got a copy of his status card. And a couple of days later, he made his journey to the spirit world. And so, as I mentioned earlier this morning, that part of Karina's job is that, you know, if somebody passes away, there's still that follow-up that needs to be done. And so she phoned the First Nations community. And when she phoned there, she said, so-and-so from your community has passed away. I need to connect up with the family. What are the arrangements going to be and stuff like that? And the person on the phone said, that person's not a member of our community. And so Karina went home that night and thought, wow, that's really weird and strange. I have a status card here. Why did they say that? So she phoned back the next day. And the lady on the phone again said, can you wait for a minute, please? And so off she went, and she came back a couple of minutes later and she said, yes, he is a member of our community. And the reason was that if you've heard of the 60 scoop, right? There was a number of people who were apprehended and placed in foreign countries. The United States was usually one of the destinations, but also at the same time that our people have also ended up in European countries, right? So the band actually had two lists, right? One for current band members and those that were in the 60 scoop. And so we were able to repatriate the body back to his community. But those are some of the things that we've dealt with some of our community members over the years, right? So we don't stop sometimes when, you know, these kinds of things happen to them. We dig further. And, you know, that's hopefully some of our roles that we're able to provide. And, you know, at this point, after completing this part of this research project, one of the things that I was thinking about was that we need to take it to the next level. As I've been speaking throughout the world, from Patagonia in Chile, from Guatemala, from Peru, from Mexico, and from other indigenous communities, including the Māori of New Zealand and the Aboriginal people in Australia, I've often mentioned to them that I'd really like to take this to an international level and, you know, do that kind of work that would help out their communities as well in looking at the resiliency of people who are living with HIV and AIDS and why is that happening, and, you know, how can we get that message out to our communities. So I think we're going to stop there, right? I wanted to show the angst part of the methodology piece, but another presentation, because I see the other presenters are arriving too. So are we ahead of time, or?
You're right on.
We're right on time.